the task at hand. At Homeboy in particular, we know that what you have to do sometimes is dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth and feeling their worth. Marcus Borg, the late great scripture scholar, says that the principal suffering of the poor throughout scripture and throughout history is shame and disgrace, and I think that's quite right. I would invite you to take a leisurely stroll through the Acts of the Apostles, and if you do that, you're not going to just find it like a quaint snapshot of life in the earliest Christian community, but what you'll find instead is the measure of health in any community at all, including your own schools and including this gathering here this morning. If you read it, things will leap off the page. Things like, see how they love one another. What better way to measure? There's nobody needy in this community. Excellent metric. But my favorite one is the oddest one, and it just says simply, and awe came upon everyone. It would seem that the measure of our health as a community may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry. So some years ago I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And a lot of times, most of the times, I get letters like this and I just see the date and yeah, sure, I'll do it. And I don't pay that much attention, what is this exactly and how, and I always presume, like yesterday I spoke to the equivalent group here in the region of Peel, Human Services folks. And it was a keynote that ended their conference. So I figured keynote at the end, maybe lunch, maybe the beginning. And then later on I went back to the letter to kind of see. I knew it was a one-day conference, and sure enough, it was a gang-in service. So from 9 to 5, I was to be the only speaker. So I quickly invite two homies in, Andre and Jose, and I sit them down and I say, look, you're going to fly with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. But I'd never heard their stories, and Jose gets up, and he kind of in a low-key manner, he begins, and Jose, about 25 years old at the time, he had gone through our 18-month program, and we have different phases, including what we call the humble phase. First 3 months, you're cleaning toilets, that's it, which is a great equalizer, because if some big bad shot caller leader gang member comes, he's going to clean toilets like everybody else. It works. And then he worked his way into various social enterprises and offices, and finally ended up as a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery and now helping younger folks with their addiction issues. A gang member, tattooed, been to prison, but he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up and begins his story. And he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped, and he said, it sounds way worser in Spanish, he said. Well, we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. I guess I was 9, he said, when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walked us up to an orphanage, and she knocked on the door, and when the man came to the door, she said, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me. And my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt you could still see the blood. Finally, the third t-shirt you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. When he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. And now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For here's the truth, and you all know it. If you do not welcome your own wounds, you will be tempted to despise the wounded. As a priest, I am in like 25 different detention facilities where I say Mass on the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, on a rotating basis. And on Saturdays, I usually have a couple in the morning, and they're kind of far off. And then, and because I've been in this community, though not as pastor for a while, but I know everybody at Dolores Mission. I get asked to do all sorts of sacraments and stuff. So I race back every Saturday. So at 1 o'clock I have baptisms, and 2 o'clock I have a wedding, and 3 o'clock a quinceañera where a girl turns 15 in the Latino community, and 4 o'clock exorcism. Just checking to see if you're still listening. I've never done one of those, but I came home once and it was about 12:30, and I thought, well, I can go to my office. And in those days it was on First Street, not far from the church, and I would go through my mail, and I was just, contento, sitting there at my desk, going through the mail, all by myself. And then suddenly this woman comes in, and her name is Lisa. And this is the first time she's ever stepped foot in my office. And it's now 15 minutes to 1. And Lisa, kind of infamous, everybody knows who she is. I mean, she's a prostitute, heroin addict, gang member, felon, parolee, tattooed. Walks up and down First Street. In Spanish, we would call her, she was kind of a famous gritona, which means she screams a lot. And so you'd always hear her next door when she gets tossed out of the bar. And the guy, the owner, tosses her out, and she's screaming at him. Back in the day when we had payphones, she'd scream into the payphone, just let me stay tonight, pleading with family or friends. And this is the very first time she's stepped foot in my office, and now it's 10 minutes to 1. She comes into my inner office and plunks herself down, and she launches right in. I need help. Ooh, I've been to like 50 rehabs. I'm known all over, nationwide. And then she kind of wanders in her tale. Yeah, I went to Catholic schools all my life. Graduated from elementary. I even graduated from Sacred Heart High School in Lincoln Heights. And then she pauses and she says, in fact, right after I graduated was when I first used heroin. And I've been trying to stop since the moment I began. And then I watched as she leaned her head against the wall, and her eyes became like 2 ponds, water rising to meet its edges and spilling over. And she cried until finally she leveled her gaze at me and she said, I am a a disgrace. And suddenly her shame meets mine, because when I had seen her step into my office that afternoon, I had mistaken her for an interruption. And the soul feels its worth. And we bring ourselves to a sense of connection and mutuality that is God's dream come true. And so you stand at the margins in your own particularity, and you know that if you stand there, the margins get erased. And maybe, in fact, people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. And isn't that your job description, but to make those voices heard? All of us are called to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And that's what Pope Francis calls us to, of course. It's the joy of the gospel. Jesus only took 4 things seriously. They're big things, but they're only 4. Inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and acceptance. Those are the only things that matter. I was reading in a magazine that they did a Q&A with Whoopi Goldberg, and they asked her, what living person do you most admire? And she said, Pope Francis. And then she said, yeah, he's going with the original program. I love that. I think that's it. The original program, everybody knows what it is. Inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional love and kindness, acceptance. It's the joy of the gospel. An interviewer, a reporter, finished an interview with me by saying, how's it feel to have saved thousands and thousands of lives? I said, I don't mean to be coy or cute. I don't know what you're talking about. I know that my life is saved every day that I show up. I'm saved from my cowardice. I'm saved from my insistence that I have the right position. I'm liberated every single day by the men and women who come through these doors. I think saving lives is for the Coast Guard. My life is saved. I had a hardcore gang intervention worker, a former gang member in Houston, Texas, who pleaded with me, how do you reach them? I said, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? That's the only thing that matters. But that's what we're supposed to do, is allow ourselves to be reached. 35 years ago, I was privileged to be taught at Harvard Divinity School by Henry Nouwen. And it was a course on ministry, and somebody asked him, what is ministry? And he says, can you receive people? That's it. We think it's about saving, fixing, doing, serving. No, can you receive people? And I think that's quite right. The original covenant between God and God's people, God said, as I have loved you, we think he's going to say, you must love me back. And what he says instead is, as I have loved you, may you have a particular special love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And God says this for a reason. He thinks that the widow, orphan, and the stranger, their particular suffering is that they know what it's like to be cut off. And because they know that suffering, they are eminently trustworthy to guide the rest of us to show our way to kinship and to the kingdom of God. I'm going to tell one last story because that's exceedingly annoying. So let me just do one last and we're going to take a break because I think the sound system is pooped. So So people ask me, and then so get your questions ready, and any question will lead to a long-ass answer, so don't worry about that. In which I'll tell more stories. So I'll only need 3. So, but here's a question I'll anticipate. People always ask about enemies, rivals working together. And it's dicey at first, but homie will come to me and say, I'm ready, 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 and then I'll say, okay, I have an opening in the bakery, but you have to work with X, Y, and Z, and I rattle off the names of rivals, enemies. And they always do the same thing, they think for a while, and then they go, okay, I'll work with them, I'm not going to talk. And I remember how much that bothered me in my early days, until you discover, of course, that it's impossible for human beings to demonize people they know. Humans can't really sustain that. They can't pull that off. So I had a little chaparrito, a little short guy, 19 years old. Everybody called him Youngster. That was his gang name. And I thought he was ready. So I bring him to Homeboy Silkscreen, which is a kind of off-campus, a factory, been around for 22 years. Over 2,500 customers, thousands and thousands of rival enemy gang members have worked there over the years. So I'm introducing him to his coworkers, and there are 30 of them, and many rivals, many enemies. And so I watch him shake hands with each one, and I'm impressed, because he's a firm handshake, looking him in the eye. I go, wow, this is great. Until he gets to the last guy, and the last guy is a guy everybody calls Puppet, and Puppet seems to be wanting to avoid this encounter altogether. And so when Puppet and Youngster are in each other's vicinity, they mumble something, they stare at their shoes, they don't shake hands. And, well, I know they're enemies because I know what gangs they're from, but he just shook hands with a whole bunch of enemies. I discovered later that this is a hatred that's really quite personal and very deep, and beyond which neither of them think they can get past. So I sensed that much at the moment, and so I said, look, if you guys can't hang working together, let me know, because I got a bunch of people who would love this job, and they don't say a word. 6 months later, a Puppet leaves his home to go to a corner store some distance from his house to purchase something, and he buys it, and on the way home, for some reason, he decides to take a shortcut, so he dodges into an alley. And because he's taken this detour, suddenly, unexpectedly, he's surrounded by 10 members of a rival gang, 10 against 1. And they beat him badly. And he falls to the ground, and while he's lying on the ground, they will not stop kicking his head until he's lifeless. Somebody finds his body and takes him to White Memorial Hospital, where he's declared effectively brain dead. But it's the policy there to keep you connected to machines for 2 days. So you can have 48 hours of what they call a flat read. If there's no brain activity for 48 hours, then the doctors can sign the death certificate, making it official. This allowed family and friends to gather. I was at St. Louis University giving a talk. I flew home immediately. I've seen a lot of horrible things in my life, but nothing to compare to the sight of this young man with his head swollen many times its size. It was horrifying. You could barely train your eyes on him. So as a priest, at the end of the 2 days, I said a blessing prayer over him. I anointed his forehead with oil. We disconnected, and a week later, we buried him. But in the first 24 hours, while Puppet was lying beaten in the hospital, I was alone in my office, and it was 8:30 at night, and the phone rings, and it's Youngster, Puppet's co-worker at the silkscreen factory, and he says, "Hey, that's messed up about what happened to Puppet." And I said, "Yeah, it is." And then with a certain kind of eagerness even, he says, "Is there anything I can do? Can I give him my blood?" We both fall silent under the weight of it, until finally he breaks the silence choking back his tears. And he says with great deliberation, "He was not my enemy. He was my friend. We worked together." Now, can I say that always happens at Homeboy Industries? Of course it does. Any exceptions? No. Can't think of a single one. And it shouldn't surprise us that God's own dream come true for us, that we be one, just happens to be our own deepest longing for ourselves. For it turns out it's mutual. And so you stand at the margins because that's what Jesus would do. That's what Jesus did. And you take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And you look under your feet and the margins are getting erased because you're standing there. And then you cease to care whether anybody accuses you of wasting your time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Make those voices heard so the soul feels its worth. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, wait for it. See you back here at 11. Thank you very much.